Okay, so Caraval, right? It's everywhere. You hear all this buzz. But is it actually good? Should you spend your precious reading time on it?
That's what we're here to help you figure out. Caraval's one of those books people seem to either love or hate.
And we'll be honest up front, we kind of land in the flawed but fun camp. If you want to escape, get lost in some gorgeous writing, maybe a little swoony romance,
Yeah.
go for it. But
But if you're the kind of reader who needs deep world building, characters you can really sink your teeth into, might not be your jam.
but that's why we're doing this deep dive. We'll give you examples of both sides, the amazing stuff and the parts that made us go, huh. So by the end, you'll know if it's right for you.
Exactly. No more just relying on hype.
Okay, so let's get everyone on the same page. Two sisters, Scarlett and Tella. They're escaping a bad situation with their dad, and they end up at Caraval, which is this legendary magical game, right?
Right. And Tella gets kidnapped as part of the game, so Scarlett has to win to save her. Sounds pretty intense, yeah.
Definitely hooks you in. But I've seen a lot of reviews saying that's where the book kind of loses it.
Yeah, the premise is great, but the execution is where people get divided. A big part of that is the writing itself. Some people love it, some hate it.
Garber style, right. I've seen people online either gushing about it or saying it's way too much.
Exactly. You'll get these lines, like when she's describing a touch, and it's colors erupted from his skin as soft as velvet and as sharp as sparks that turn into straws. Very visual. Fits the whole dreamy vibe of the book.
Yeah, I can see that being appealing. Almost like poetry.
But then you get stuff like a character tasting like midnight and wind, and you're just, what?
Like tasting like midnight? I don't even know what that means.
Right. It's what people call purple prose. When the writing tries so hard to be beautiful, it becomes kind of meaningless.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that being a turnoff for some readers.
For sure. And then we get to the characters, which is another area where Caraval gets mixed reviews.
From what I've gathered, they're not exactly the most well-developed.
That's a common complaint. So Scarlett, our main character, she's supposed to be this young, kind of naive girl, but also fiercely protective of her sister. Her wanting to save Tella is great, but she comes across as way too trusting, easily manipulated.
Even for a YA protagonist. I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes those characters can be a bit innocent, but
Even then, she seems a bit too passive, which is tough because we're stuck with her point of view the whole time. Then you've got Tella, who's definitely more interesting. She's reckless, impulsive, stands out from Scarlett.
so like she could be really cool.
Totally. But we just don't get enough of her inner workings. You see glimpses of her motivations, but not enough. And then there's Julian, the love interest. At first, he's all mysterious and charming, but
But falls into that classic bad boy trope. I know the type. Can be hot at first, but gets old fast.
yep. There are hints of a deeper backstory, but it never really goes anywhere. Some readers might eat it up, but if you want well-rounded characters, it's gonna let you down.
Okay, so beautiful but sometimes overblown writing. Characters that could be deeper. What about the world building? Fantasy fans are usually pretty picky about that.
And this is where Caraval really stumbles for a lot of people. The experience of Caraval itself, visually, that's incredible. The descriptions of everything, the sets, the costumes, the atmosphere, vivid. But the world outside of that, the magic system, super vague.
So, like, it's all about the surface, not so much what's holding it all up.
Exactly. Think of it like a stage production. Beautiful set, great costumes, but nothing behind the curtain. If you just want spectacle, you might not mind. But if you need that solid foundation, that logic, disappointing.
All right, so we've got the writing, the characters, the world building. What about the plot itself? Does it live up to that exciting premise?
It's fast-paced, I'll give it that. Lots of twists and turns, but some are kind of predictable, and it relies a lot on the, well, it's magic explanation.
Ah, so not a lot of logic holding it together.
Sometimes it feels like the author was going for shock value over making sure everything actually made sense, like prioritizing how it feels over having a tight plot.
So a bit style over substance, maybe.
In some ways, yeah. To help you figure out if this is for you, let's compare Caraval to some other books you might know.
I like comparisons. Like, okay, if I like this, will I like this?
Exactly. So if you loved the whole atmosphere and romance of the night circus, you'll find some of that in Caraval. But Caraval leans way harder into the romance and isn't as grounded in reality.
More whimsical, less real world?
Yeah. And if we're talking about the kind of dream logic of the game itself, it's a bit like Alice in Wonderland. But Caraval has darker themes, touches on stuff like abuse and manipulation more directly.
Alice in Wonderland, but with an edge.
Exactly. And there's a slight mystery element, so you could even compare it to something like Stalking Jack the Ripper, though Caraval isn't as focused on solving a specific crime.
So it's pulling from all these different places, but not fully committing to any one genre.
Right. Blend of fantasy, romance, mystery, but yeah, romance is definitely front and center. And one thing that makes Caraval interesting is it's not all black and white, good versus evil, you know? Take Legend, the guy running this whole game.
Yeah, you said before he's not exactly a villain, but he is manipulating everyone.
He is, but his reasons are complicated. It's not like he's just doing it to be mean. He's actually trying to protect something really important to him, even if the way he does it is questionable.
So it's more about trying to understand where he's coming from than just judging him right away.
Exactly. And that goes for a lot of the characters in Caraval. They've all got secrets. They're driven by their own desires. You're left as the reader to figure out who to trust, whose actions make sense, even if they're not always good.
It sounds like the book wants you to think critically about the choices these characters make, even when those choices aren't easy to categorize.
That's what makes it more than just a fun, fluffy fantasy. It makes you engage with these deeper themes, you know, about why people do what they do, about the allure of this world where the rules are different.
Okay, so we've talked about the writing, the characters, this whole morally gray area.
Mhm.
What about some specific moments? Were there any parts that really worked for you or parts that just fell flat?
One thing that gets a lot of praise is the magic system. It's not your typical spells and potions. It's all about the power of belief, illusion, that kind of thing.
So the more you believe in the magic of Caraval, the more powerful it becomes.
Exactly. Which ties into the whole theme of storytelling and imagination. Caraval is like this living story, and the people who play are pulled into that narrative, whether they want to be or not.
Hold on, so it's like the book is commenting on how stories can actually change our reality. That's pretty meta.
In a way, yeah. And that can be really cool for some readers, but for others, it might feel like a way to hand wave away plot holes or inconsistencies.
I can see how that would be divisive. You really have to buy into that concept for it to work.
Totally. And that's what it comes down to with Caraval. Are you the kind of reader who's willing to let go of logic a little bit and just embrace the fantastical, even if it means sacrificing some realism along the way?
So personal preference plays a big role. Some people love that blurring of lines between reality and fantasy. Others want things more clear-cut. Speaking of clear-cut, we talked before about how the world building outside the game itself is kind of vague.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give some examples of what you mean?
Sure. Like, we know it takes place on this group of islands, but we never get a real sense of the politics, the history, how society functions outside of the game. It's like the rest of the world is just this blurry backdrop.
So the focus is solely on Caraval, not so much on the context surrounding it.
Yeah, it's like being invited to this incredible party, but you have no idea who the host is, why you're there, what happens if you break the rules.
It sounds like Caraval prioritizes the immediate impact, the sights, the sounds, the emotions, over really exploring the world in depth.
It does, and I think that's intentional. It creates this sense of mystery, even disorientation, which is kind of what the characters are experiencing in the game. Remember, Caraval is designed to mess with your perceptions, challenge your assumptions.
So the vagueness is part of the point.
Exactly. It keeps you guessing, puts you in the same boat as the characters, who are also confused and uncertain. And again, that can be thrilling for some readers, annoying for others.
It seems like Caraval is all about breaking the rules, doing things differently, even if it means leaving out elements that readers might expect from a story like this.
You got it. And that's what makes it so polarizing. It's not afraid to experiment, to try new things, but that also means it won't appeal to everyone.
So for our listener who's still on the fence, what's the most important thing to keep in mind?
I'd say this: if you really value complex characters, super detailed world building, plot twists that make logical sense, Caraval might not be the best choice. But if you're open to a story that's all about the experience, the sensory stuff, a romance that's a little bit dangerous and unpredictable, you might get swept away.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's about knowing what you want and being open to what the book offers.
Exactly. That's what makes reading so fun, right? Trying new things, stepping outside your comfort zone.
Absolutely. Speaking of exploring, we've covered a lot: the writing, characters, this whole morality thing, the plot. But there's one element we haven't talked about yet that feels really important to Caraval: the theme of sisterhood.
Oh, good point. The relationship between Scarlett and Donatella is at the core of everything. It drives the plot. It's behind so many of their choices.
From what I've heard, it's a complicated relationship. It's not all sunshine and roses. There's love, but there's also rivalry, sacrifice,
Exactly. So you've got Scarlett, the older sister, who's more cautious, responsible. She feels like she has to protect Donatella, who's the opposite, impulsive and rebellious.
Pretty classic sibling dynamic with
It
her.
is. But Garber goes deeper than that. She shows how their love can be a strength, but also a weakness.
Can you give me some examples of how that plays out?
Sure. Like, Scarlett's whole reason for going to Caraval in the first place is to save Donatella from their abusive father.
Hmm.
She sees it as this chance to give her sister a better life and escape.
So her love for Donatella is her main motivation.
Yeah, but that same love also blinds her to some of the dangers. She's so focused on protecting Donatella that she becomes easy to manipulate by legend by other characters who want to use her.
So her good intentions kind of backfire on her.
In a way, yeah. And then you've got Donatella, who's actually more aware of the dangers of Caraval, but she's also willing to take risks.
Which clashes with Scarlett, trying to keep her safe.
Exactly. That tension between them, their different personalities, their choices, it creates a lot of conflict, keeps things interesting.
It sounds like Caraval is showing us how complicated sisterhood can be in a way that feels relatable, but also unique.
It is. It shows that deep bond, the loyalty between sisters, but also the struggles they face figuring out who they are as individuals.
So it's not just a romanticized, perfect view of sisterhood.
Nope. It's messy, it's real, it acknowledges that these relationships can be both amazing and difficult at the same time.
That's cool to see. It's not always easy to find that kind of nuance in YA fantasy, especially when it comes to family relationships.
I agree, and it's definitely something that draws readers to Caraval. It doesn't shy away from those messy human emotions, even in this fantastical setting.
So for someone who loves stories about strong female relationships, the bond between Scarlett and Donatella is something to pay attention to.
Absolutely. It adds a whole other layer to the book, even if the world building and character development might not be for everyone.
Okay, we've covered a lot. Writing, characters, morally gray areas, plot, sisterhood. Anything else we should mention before we wrap up?
One thing I'd emphasize is that Caraval is a book that rewards rereads. There are so many layers to the story, so much symbolism woven throughout, that you'll likely catch new things each time you go back to it.
Oh, so it's not just a one and done kind of book.
Definitely not. It's the kind of book you could discuss with friends, analyze in a book club, maybe even write an essay about.
I love that. Books that spark conversations make you think.
Me too. And Caraval, even with its flaws, definitely has that potential.
So much to think about.
Yeah.
We've talked about the writing, the characters, how the world is kind of morally gray, the plot,
Ah.
that intense bond between the sisters.
Yeah.
What's the final takeaway for our listener who's trying to decide if Caraval is worth picking up?
I think the biggest thing is, what do you want from a book? If
Yeah.
you want pure escapism, something visually stunning, a bit of romance, a bit of mystery, Caraval might be perfect.
But if you're someone who needs the world to be super fleshed out, characters with lots of depth, a plot that makes perfect sense logically, maybe not so much.
Exactly. It's like sometimes you want a really decadent dessert,
Right.
right? And sometimes you want a full meal, something more substantial.
I love that. Caraval as dessert, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Tempting, beautiful.
Yeah.
But maybe not going to keep you full for long.
Yep. And I know some people are out there thinking, okay, but the sequels, maybe those improve things, expand on the world, give the characters more to work with.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd be wondering the same thing.
From what I've heard, the sequels do go a little deeper, especially with Legend and Donatella, more backstory for them, you understand their motivations better. But the writing, it stays pretty much the same. So if that purple prose, the lack of detailed world building, if that really bothered you in the first book, you'll probably have the same issues with the sequels.
So it's more for the people who were already hooked,
Right.
who are okay with those things because they love the overall experience.
Exactly. Like going back to your favorite bakery for that same cake, even if it's got a little too much frosting, you know what you're getting and you enjoy it anyway.
You're on a roll with the food analogies today. So helpful. Okay, for our listener who's still making up their mind, what's the one question they should ask themselves to figure out if Caraval is right for them?
I'd say it's this. Are you willing to just go with it? To accept that this is a world where feeling and sensory experience matter more than strict logic?
Because Caraval definitely asks that of its readers.
It does. And if the answer is yes, if you're ready to be swept away by a story that's more about the journey than a perfect destination, then Caraval might be just the thing. But if you really need that solid foundation, those deeply developed characters, maybe look elsewhere.
That sums it up perfectly. And at the end of the day, that's what's so great about reading, right? Everyone's different. What one person loves, another person might not.
Absolutely. Try new things. Trust your gut when you're picking out a book.
That's what we hope we've helped you do today. We've given you the info, the comparisons, some things to think about. Now it's up to you, dear listener. Dive into Caraval or move on to another adventure. Happy reading.